From a very young age, he learned that inside that house there was no room for those who made mistakes. Nothing had to be said directly. The looks, the casual comments, and the constant comparisons did the work. While others were praised for small achievements, he always seemed to be one step behind even when he tried harder. Any attempt to help was seen as an obligation. Any failure was seen as confirmation that he was good for nothing. Over time, the label stopped being just external and began to live inside him. Family conversations rarely included his name in a positive way. When it did appear, it was associated with disappointment, delay, or trouble. If he stayed silent, he was called complacent. If he tried to explain himself, they said he was playing the victim. Gradually, he began to believe that maybe he really was broken, different, incapable of making anyone proud. The environment became heavy, suffocating. He woke up every day feeling like he owed something he could never repay. The house, which should have been a refuge, became a silent courtroom where he was always the defendant. And the worst part wasn't the harsh words, but the certainty that no one was willing to hear his version. For the others, the story was already written. He was the mistake that insisted on staying. What no one imagined was that, while being treated as useless, he carried something he never told anyone. A secret built in the past, in silence, away from the spotlight, which required courage, responsibility, and sacrifice. Something that, if revealed at that moment, would be discredited. So, he kept quiet. And he paid the price of silence every day, not knowing that that judgment would only be the beginning of a much greater fall. Not his, but of those who condemned him. The argument started like so many others, over something small, almost irrelevant. A misplaced glass, a sharp response, a comment said in a tone of contempt. But this time, something was different in the air. There wasn't just irritation. There was a decision. The words came harsher, more direct, loaded with something that had been rehearsed for a long time. He tried to reason, to explain, to ask for calm. It was useless. For someone who already had a sentence ready, no defense matters. They called him dead weight, a hindrance, someone who sucked everything up and gave nothing back. Each phrase seemed carefully chosen to hurt where it pained most. It wasn't just about leaving the house. It was about erasing his importance, reducing his existence to a mistake that would finally be corrected. When they said he had until the end of the day to leave, there were no screams. There was silence. A heavy, awkward silence that said more than any insult. He looked around, trying to memorize the space that, despite everything, he still called home. The walls held memories that no one there seemed to value. But at that moment, none of that mattered. The message was clear. He was no longer welcome. He took a few things, only the essentials. There were no goodbyes. No one asked where he was going. For them, it was enough that he was gone. As he crossed the door, he felt something strange. It wasn't just sadness. There was also relief. The pain of rejection was real, but smaller than the daily pain of trying to prove worth to those who never wanted to see it. What no one realized was that that expulsion, done with contempt and a certainty of superiority, was pushing him exactly toward the moment when the secret he kept would no longer be just his. That day, he left without looking back, not out of pride, but because he knew that when he returned, nothing would be as before. Outside, the street seemed larger than ever. With no clear destination, he walked for a few minutes just to push away the weight of what had just happened. Each step was accompanied by confused thoughts, old memories, and an insistent question. How did everything reach this point? For anyone watching from afar, he was exactly what they said. A man without direction, without visible achievements, without apparent utility. But that image was only the surface of something much deeper. What no one knew, and he made a point of keeping it that way for years, was that his real life happened away from the eyes of his family. While he was treated as someone unproductive, he had been building something in silence. Not for revenge, nor out of pride, but for protection. Early on, he learned that sharing dreams in that environment was the same as offering them to be destroyed. Every idea he revealed became a reason for irony. Every attempt was treated as a waste of time. That was why he decided to keep everything to himself. He worked in secret, studied when no one believed, made choices that seemed insignificant to those who only saw immediate results. Many nights were spent in front of a screen in absolute silence while the rest of the house slept. He didn't seek approval. He sought freedom. The secret wasn't just something material. It was an entire exit plan, a strategy built with patience, mistakes, and discipline. There were moments when he almost gave up, especially when the words inside the house became harsher. But curiously, those same words pushed him to continue. Each insult reinforced the certainty that he needed to prove something, not to them, but to himself. Upon being expelled, he understood that the secret was about to be tested. There was no longer an emotional shelter, nor a physical one. All he had now was what he had built away from the eyes of those who called him useless. And in that instant, he realized something decisive. What seemed like failure to others was, in fact, the perfect disguise for the moment when his true story would begin to be revealed. The first few days out of the house were the hardest. There was no comfort, no guarantees, no one waiting for him at the end of the day. He slept in makeshift places, accepted minimal help when it arose, and learned quickly not to explain his story too much. The less people knew, the less they judged. To the world, he was just another one trying to get by. To himself, it was a daily test of endurance. He got temporary jobs, services that required more from the body than the mind. They were tiring, poorly paid, and invisible, but they served one essential purpose: to maintain a routine. While many would have given in to discouragement, he used each day as training for something bigger. The secret he carried didn't depend on luxury, but on consistency. And consistency was something he had already learned to master. At night, when exhaustion finally allowed him to sit in silence, he resumed what he always did in secret. He studied, analyzed, corrected mistakes. There was no applause, no recognition, just silent progress. Sometimes thoughts of his family appeared like a shadow, not with anger but with a strange clarity. He understood now that he would never have grown in that environment. The expulsion, as cruel as it had been, set him free. There were moments of doubt, days when the money almost ran out, nights when loneliness weighed more than any old offense. But whenever he thought about giving up, he remembered the label he carried for years. Useless. That word, which used to hurt, now worked as fuel. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone, he just needed to continue. Without noticing, he began to transform. Not externally. He still looked like the same ordinary man. But inside, the security he never had began to form. He knew that time was on his side. And when the right moment came, it wouldn't be necessary to scream the truth. It would appear on its own. And when that happened, there would be no way to ignore it. As time went by, something began to change almost imperceptibly. It wasn't a major event or a sudden turn. They were small signs, discrete results that, added up, indicated that the silent path he had been walking was beginning to bear fruit. A contact who responded, an opportunity that arose, an unexpected recognition coming from someone who didn't know him by his past. For the first time, he felt he wasn't just surviving, he was advancing. The secret he kept, built with patience and anonymity, began to materialize in a concrete way. What before existed only as a plan now generated real results. Even so, he maintained the same stance: silence and focus. He knew that exposing himself too soon could jeopardize everything, not out of fear of his family, but out of respect for his own process. He didn't want to prove they were wrong. He wanted to be sure he was right about himself. Meanwhile, on the other side, the people who expelled him went on with their lives convinced they had made the right decision. Comments appeared here and there, always loaded with certainty. To them, time would only confirm what they always said. What they didn't know was that time was working in the opposite direction. Each day spent away from that toxic environment further strengthened the version of him that was never allowed to exist at home. He began to see himself differently. He no longer presented himself internally as someone trying to prove worth, but as someone who already possessed it. The difference was subtle, yet powerful. This change was reflected in his decisions, in the way he positioned himself, and even in the way he walked. There was no arrogance. There was firmness. And it was during this period that he understood something essential. The secret wasn't just what he did, but who he became in the process. Even if no one ever knew his trajectory, he was no longer the same man who walked out the door being called useless. Something irreversible had happened, and soon, this would cease to be invisible. What was once just silent progress gradually began to take public shape, not by his choice, but because it was no longer possible to hide the results. People began to seek him out, not out of pity, but out of real interest. They wanted to know how he thought, how he solved problems, how he arrived at solutions that others didn't see. For many, he seemed to have appeared out of nowhere. For him, it was just the continuation of years of invisible preparation. He began to occupy spaces where before he would never have been imagined. Environments where his voice was heard with attention, not interrupted with contempt. For the first time, he realized the weight of being respected without needing to beg for it. Still, he maintained his discretion. He didn't mention the past, he didn't tell his story. He knew that what impressed people wasn't the pain he lived through, but the clarity he carried now. Meanwhile, his absence began to be felt where it was previously ignored. Problems arose, small failures accumulated, things that used to work automatically stopped working, and slowly the question began to circulate: how did he do it without anyone noticing? But pride prevented any direct contact. Recognizing his importance would mean admitting a mistake that no one there was ready to own up to. He, in turn, felt no desire for confrontation. There was no anger, nor need for revenge. What he felt was something rarer. Peace. Peace in knowing that he no longer needed to defend himself against distorted versions of himself. His life now followed another logic. The past had fulfilled its role, teaching him to survive. The present was teaching him to thrive. And it was at that moment that he realized the secret was no longer just his. Even without words, the world began to see what his family never wanted to see. And this silent recognition prepared the ground for an inevitable reunion. Not of bodies, but of truths. The reunion didn't happen directly. There was no emotional phone call or explicit apology. It came disguised, almost shyly, through crossed comments, indirect questions, curiosities cast to the wind. Someone mentioned his name in a conversation. Another recognized his image in an unexpected context. Gradually, the narrative that had been created about him began to crumble. For those who had expelled him, the discovery was uncomfortable. The idea that the useless one had become someone relevant generated a mix of disbelief and denial. At first, they tried to minimize it, then to question it. Finally, they could no longer ignore it. The truth didn't arrive as an attack, but as a mirror. And mirrors, when they show what we don't want to see, usually provoke silence. He knew this from a distance. He felt no satisfaction. What he felt was closure, as if an old cycle had finally found its ending point. There was no more need for explanations. The past, which for so long had defined him, now only contextualized him. He was not the result of rejection. He was the result of persistence. In that moment, he understood something profound. Some people only realize someone's value when they feel the lack of what that person sustained in silence. But this perception almost always arrives too late. He no longer needed that recognition. His value was no longer up for discussion, neither inside nor out. Life moved on. New challenges arose. New responsibilities too. But there was an essential difference. Now he chose where to stay. Not out of neediness, but out of alignment. The past had tried to break him. Instead, it prepared him. And that wasn't something anyone could take from him. When there was finally direct contact, it wasn't loaded with exaggerated emotion. There were no tears or long speeches. There was estrangement, a heavy silence full of unspoken words. On the other side, there was an expectation of explanations, perhaps even justifications. But he offered none. He understood that he didn't need to convince anyone of anything. The conversation was short, almost formal. Questions arose, but the answers were simple. He didn't talk about hard nights or old humiliations. He spoke only of the present, of what he did now. of where he was. And that was enough to break all the certainties that had been built about him. The absence of resentment caused more impact than any accusation could. For those listening, it was impossible to reconcile that firm and serene posture with the image of the weak man that had been painted for years. The truth was uncomfortable. He no longer needed them to feel complete. He didn't seek approval or reparation. He had moved on without asking for permission. After this meeting, he felt something rare: lightness. Not because everything had been resolved, but because there was nothing left pending. The past had been faced, not to be relived, but to be left behind for good. He didn't leave there better than anyone else. He just left whole. And perhaps that was the greatest surprise for everyone. The secret that changed everything wasn't a material achievement or public recognition. It was the ability to no longer carry the weight of what they tried to make of him. That indeed changed everything. For a long time, everyone believed that the secret he kept was something grand, almost cinematic, a hidden inheritance, a rare talent discovered by chance, an unlikely turn of luck. But the truth was simpler, and precisely because of that, more powerful. The secret was never what he had, but what he built when no one was looking. While he was seen as a burden, he learned to observe. While he was ignored, he learned to listen. Every criticism became data. Every rejection became an adjustment. He spent years developing skills, studying, failing in silence, and starting over as many times as necessary. None of this seemed impressive from the outside. But inside, he was creating a foundation that didn't depend on anyone's approval. When the results appeared, many wanted to associate it with luck. Others said he changed after he had the opportunity. None of them realized that the opportunity only worked because it found someone prepared. What seemed sudden to others was, in fact, the accumulation of small decisions, made when no one believed in him. The secret also involved something even deeper. He stopped trying to prove worth. He began to act as someone who already knew who he was. This internal change altered everything: the way he spoke, how he positioned himself, how he chose whom to walk with. People feel that. Respect starts there. In the end, the secret that changed everything didn't fit into simple words. It was invisible discipline, silent resilience, and the courage to continue even when being seen seemed impossible. And ironically, that was what made him impossible to ignore. Years later, when his trajectory was already consolidated, the question arose that many had been waiting to ask since the beginning: if he felt like going back. To go back to show them, to go back to confront them, to go back to prove they were wrong. But the answer never came in the way they imagined. He didn't go back. Not because he couldn't, but because he didn't need to. The greatest sign of overcoming was not visible success, nor late recognition. It was the absence of desire for validation. He understood that some people only see utility, never potential, and trying to convince those who never believed would be a way to remain stuck to a past that no longer defined him. He built a new story far from where he was rejected. He created different bonds based on respect, not convenience. He learned that belonging is not something one begs for, it is something one chooses. And that choice changed everything. For the first time, he was in a place where he didn't have to shrink himself to fit in. His silence bothered them more than any revenge. Because success without confrontation is the hardest proof to ignore. There were no final speeches or dramatic scenes. There was continuity, life in motion, constant growth. In the end, the man who was expelled as a useless person did not turn into someone driven by resentment. He turned into someone free from judgment, the need for approval, and the emotional ties of the past. The secret that changed everything was revealed not in words but in choices, and those choices took him far beyond any expectation that they once tried to impose on him. Some stories don't end with applause. They end with silence and dignity. He didn't need to go back to prove anything. He didn't need to confront those who rejected him. The biggest answer was to keep living and winning without asking for permission. Perhaps this story has touched on something you have lived through. Perhaps you too have been underestimated, discarded, labeled as incapable. If so, remember, time reveals what words cannot explain. If this story made sense to you, subscribe to the channel. Here, real stories show that not every beginning defines the end. Like the video, this helps the channel reach more people who need to hear messages like this. And share it with someone who has been discredited. Sometimes all a person needs is to know they are not alone. Thank you for watching. See you in the next story.